2, 3.
Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. When the rather bourgeois, upper-middle-class novelist Thomas Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929, both he and his older brother Heinrich had long been well-established leaders of the early 20th century German literature. At the time of the award, Heinrich's 1905 novel, Professor Unrat, Professor Filth in English, was in the process of being adapted to become Germany's very first full-length sound motion picture titled The Blue Angel, and featuring Marlene Dietrich famously singing, "Falling in love again, never wanted to, what am I to do, can't help it," and simultaneously being filmed in English as well as German, although, as pointed out in Berlin, 1910 to 1933, for the screen adaptation, denunciation of the bourgeois world was replaced by personal tragedy with the central character's social decline due to sexual obsession. It was for his 1901 largely autobiographical novel, Buddenbrooks, subtitled The Decline of a Family, covering 3 generations, that Thomas Mann was awarded the Nobel, even though it had already been followed by his famous novella Death in Venice in 1913, a play titled The Devil and His Grandmother in 1915, and then the 1924 publication of The Magic Mountain. The family saga, which the novel Buddenbrooks relates, has its real-life origins in the northern German port town of Lübeck following the Napoleonic Wars. Half a century later, a merchant named Henry Mann, who eventually became a senator, married an 11-year younger artistic-minded woman named Julia, who had been born in Brazil to a German father and Portuguese mother who died during a later stillborn child delivery when her surviving daughter was 15 years old. The senator and his wife's 4 children, Heinrich, Thomas, Carla, and the youngest girl, also named Julia, each, to one degree or another, developed artistic sensibilities, largely influenced by the salons that their mother frequently organized throughout her life. Somewhat like Heinrich's film-adapted novel, Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, which was eventually made into a motion picture starring Dirk Bogarde in 1971, depicts the personal decline and, as its title clearly states, ultimate death from cholera of a 50-year-old writer named Gustav von Aschenbach. He's described in the story as having a strong physical resemblance to the composer and conductor Gustav Mahler, who died 2 years before the publication of Death in Venice in 1911. Like the shade of an ancient Greek hero being ferried across the river Styx, Aschenbach arrives in Venice by gondola and soon develops a powerfully debilitating and unfulfilled homoerotic obsession with a young Polish boy who appears to him to be the living embodiment of the classical god Eros, and who, within the next few years, would also resemble the real author's son Klaus, toward whom diaries published after the writer's death have revealed he felt a very strong and incestuous sexual attraction. The Magic Mountain is set between 1907 and 1914. It was begun after Thomas Mann had visited his wife Katja, somewhat younger woman from a wealthy secular Jewish family who'd had an intimate relationship with her twin brother Klaus, to whom Mann himself had initially felt attracted, writing a book about incestuous twins, like Richard Wagner's operatic Parents of Siegfried, which the novelist's father-in-law unsuccessfully sought to suppress during her treatment for a respiratory illness in 1912. Published 5 years before receiving the Nobel Prize, in The Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann relates the experience of an orphaned young man who'd been raised by a grandfather and then a maternal uncle, Hans Kastorf, an engineering student, when he goes to visit a sick cousin for a period of 3 weeks in a Davos, Switzerland tuberculosis sanatorium, but becoming ill himself, and with the totally subjective nature of time as it is depicted in the novel, ends up remaining for 7 full years. During this extensive sojourn, while strangely finding his favorite cigars distasteful at the elevated mountainous altitude, Hans Kastorf comes to know an extensive group of individuals who, pretty much, provide a microcosm of pre-World War I European society. In Chapter 2 of The Magic Mountain, Mann has author observe a man who lives not only his own personal life as an individual, but also consciously or unconsciously the life of his epoch and his contemporaries. The individual who Hans Kastorf encounters include his cousin Jacob Simonson, an Italian humanist named Lodovico Settembrini, who seems to reflect many of Heinrich Mann's liberal, internationalist, anti-authoritarian opinions, a Jewish communist authoritarian convert to Jesuit Catholicism named Leo Naptha, who ultimately shoots himself during a duel with Settembrini, someone who, it's been observed, may have been based upon the Hungarian philosopher Gregor Lukács, the author of Theory of the Novel. And then there is Madame Claudia Chauchat, whose name, in French at any rate, means hot cat, and whose character has been said to be based upon Lou Andres Salome, a highly intelligent Russian woman who turned down a marriage proposal from the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and later became the world's very first female psychiatrist under the direct tutorage of Sigmund Freud. As a demonstration of her personality, when Hans Kastorf first meets Madame Chauchat, she extends her hand for him to kiss, palm turned upward. Although she leaves the mountain shortly after Hans Kastorf seeks to seduce her, at one point extensively quoting Walt Whitman's I Sing the Body Electric in French, she later returns as the mistress of Mynheer Peeperkorn, a somewhat rambling eccentric who kills himself prior to the duel between the humanist and the authoritarian, and is generally thought to have been based upon Gerhard Hauptmann, the German poet who nominated Thomas Mann for the Nobel Prize. At the end of the novel, with the beginning of the First World War down in the lowlands, Hans Kastorf finally leaves the sanatorium volunteering for the German infantry, and then heading forward in an assault across Flanders Field, within which his prospects for survival, Mann observes, are poor. Yet, the book's closing lines are, out of this universal feast of death, out of this extremity of fever, kindling the rain-washed evening sky to a fiery glow, may it be that love one day shall mount? In 1918, the year of the armistice concluding the war to end all wars and make the world safe for democracy, Thomas Mann published a Make Germany Great Again non-fiction work called Reflections of a Non-Political Man. In it, he justified the Kaiser's war effort, stating, German tradition is culture, soul, freedom, art, and not civilization, society, voting rights. The difference between intellect and politics, as a further example, is the difference between cosmopolitan and international. The former concept comes from the cultural sphere and is German. The latter comes from the sphere of civilization and democracy and is something quite different. These feelings of German exceptionalism were later somewhat echoed by the convicted and imprisoned insurrection leader in his 1924 publication Mein Kampf, Mein Struggle in English, when its failed art student author, Adolf Hitler, stated, all great cultures of the past perished only because their original creative race died off through blood poisoning, that is, by allowing themselves to be diluted through foreign influences. Before receiving the Nobel Prize in 1929, having expressed such ideas in The Magic Mountain as tolerance becomes a crime when applied to evil, in a novella called Mario and the Magician, Thomas Mann clearly seemed to have experienced a significant shift in attitude. Within this work, a German narrator, visiting Benito Mussolini's authoritarian, nationalistic, recreate the glory that was Rome and make the trains run on time, fascist Italy, witnesses the performance of a mesmerist with the power to take over people's minds, who is, finally, assassinated on stage, thereby liberating his audience from that power. It was only after an extended period of sibling estrangement regarding the First World War, cosmopolitan internationalism versus German nationalism, and the distinction between culture and civilization, according to Nigel Hamilton in a 1979 dual biography titled The Brothers Mann, that there was a reconciliation between Heinrich and Thomas, the zeitgeist, or spirit of the age, having caused each of them to come to live in the United States during the 1930s and 40s, even though the course of their personal lives and literary careers were to take very different paths. A seemingly happily married father of 6 children who became a U.S. citizen while writing 4 novels collectively titled Joseph and his brothers that related the biblical Old Testament tale of the coat of many colors, bondage in Egypt, raised from slavery through providing the Pharaoh with dream analysis, and Joseph's subsequent anonymous care for his brothers, which also would become the source for the Andrew Lloyd Webber 1982 Broadway musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Thomas Mann largely served as his older brother's keeper and that of Heinrich's younger, alcoholic, former barmaid's second wife, Nellie, who sadly committed suicide in 1944, as previously had both of the two writers' actress sisters, Carla and Julia, one in response to an engagement ending sexual blackmail, and the other in despair over the end of an affair with a married man. Ultimately, once Adolf Hitler, as described by William L. Shirer in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, had systematically begun to trump German constitutional democracy, removing all potentially opposing deep state governmental officials, in addition to using Joseph Goebbels' fake news propaganda machine to eviscerate freedom of the press, beginning on day one as a dictator and employing executive decrees in an effort to create a today Germany, tomorrow the world future that the British writer George Orwell described in his novel 1984 as a boot stomping on a human face forever, in a process that the current Illinois governor J.B. Pritzker has observed took exactly 1 month, 3 weeks, 2 days, 8 hours, and 40 minutes. Heinrich and Thomas Mann each came to Los Angeles, California, where they joined such other elitist intellectual immigrants as playwright Bertolt Brecht, composers Arnold Schoenberg and Eric Korngold, film directors Fritz Lang and Billy Wilder, as well as actors Marlene Dietrich, Peter Lorre, and Hedy Lamarr, who also, in combination with composer George Antheil, helped create the frequency hopping technology for American submarines that has subsequently come to make today's cell phones possible, along with much of the supporting cast for the 1943 Warner Brothers Academy Award-winning film Casablanca. Immigrants. Clearly, a lot of the raw material for the fiction produced by both Heinrich and Thomas Mann appears to have come from their personal life experience, even if the full extent to which this was true only became apparent posthumously. And same can be said for Thomas Mann's son, Klaus, named after his mother's twin brother, and Thomas Mann's oldest daughter, Erica, who was both a professional actress and an author. Now, Heinrich Mann died in 1950. His younger brother, Thomas, passing away 5 years later, and 6 years after his then 43-year-old son, Klaus, who'd come of age during the decadent, gender-fluid, cabaret society roaring 20s decade of the Weimar Republic, committed suicide in a Côte d'Azur Riviera hotel room in Cannes, France, his parents declining to attend the funeral. A recreational drug user who'd frequently relied upon his mother to pay both his and his 1 year older sister, Erica's bills, Klaus Mann had joined the American Army during the Second World War and been deployed to occupied Germany. directly witnessing many of the atrocities of the Nazis' authoritarian rule, and even learning that his father's country estate, as well as his and his 5 siblings' childhood home, had been used during the war by the Nazi regime as a eugenics-inspired selective breeding center where chosen Aryan young people were encouraged to conceive the next generation of their Führer's master race. Interestingly, in 1936, Klaus Mann had published his own 6th novel entitled Mephisto, which was made into a film in 1981, winning both Best Screenplay at the Cannes Film Festival and an Academy Award for Best Foreign Motion Picture a year before his father's The Magic Mountain was also released as a movie. In Mephisto, an actor, apparently based upon a notorious bisexual theater director named Gustav Gründgens, who had briefly married Klaus Mann's sister Erika, and with whom Klaus himself appears to have had a homosexual affair, rises to social prominence as a result of symbolically selling his soul to the devil while playing the role of Mephisto in a revival of Goethe's Faust, closely affiliating himself with a Hermann Göring-like character from within the upper echelons of the Nazi Party. Although, seemingly for personal reasons, Klaus Mann substitutes the main character's bisexuality for a clandestine affair with a black dominatrix. Opportunistic betrayal of human values for artistic success is the central issue within the work. Also, having divorced Gründgens before Hitler's 1933 rise to power, 2 years later, because of her vocal opposition to the Nazis, the non-binary them-they Erika Mann had her German citizenship revoked by Joseph Goebbels, and, in order to avoid becoming a woman without a country, persuaded the English poet W.H. Auden, who once stated his erotic interests had exclusively centered around idealized same-gender alter egos, to marry her, thereby establishing a legal lavender union of convenience, while also having a genitophallic Electra complex affair with the much older Jewish married orchestral conductor Bruno Walter, who, with encouragement from Alma Mahler, had popularized her deceased husband's music and, at the insistence of Joseph Goebbels, been replaced at the Berlin Philharmonic by Richard Strauss, who wrote the Will to Power Friedrich Nietzsche-inspired music used by Stanley Kubrick as the theme for the motion picture 2001, A Space Odyssey, a marriage that lasted until her death in 1969, 8 years before her youngest violist and composer brother, Michael, appears to have killed himself in 1977. A decade or so after the publication of his son Klaus's book, Mephisto, Thomas Mann, while making anti-fascist radio broadcasts to help inspire resistance in Germany, also took up the soul-searching for success theme that his son had previously explored regarding his father's one-time son-in-law within his own novel titled Dr. Faustus, the life of the German composer Adrian Leverkorn, as told by a friend. This book, ostensibly a biography, describes the life, education, and career of a childhood best friend of its narrator, Serenis Zeitblum, meaning serene flowering of the age, and progresses from elementary school to a decade of Friedrich Nietzsche-like mental incapacity before the main character's death in 1940. As the events within the story unfold, there are fully transcribed lectures on such subjects as why Ludwig van Beethoven's Sonata Opus 111 does not have a third movement, and a theory of musical harmony like that developed by Arnold Schoenberg, who threatened to sue over copyright infringement, and that he had dedicated to the hallowed memory of Gustav Mahler, about which, according to a note in a recent Chicago Symphony Orchestra program, Richard Strauss once wrote to Mahler's widow, Alma, who had an affair with the painter Oskar Kokoschka and later married leading Bauhaus architect Walter Gropius, and who had walked 100 miles across the Pyrenees Mountains with Heinrich Mann and his wife to escape the Nazis by crossing into Spain from occupied France, Strauss stating, "Only a psychiatrist could help poor Schoenberg now." Covering a full range of what at the time was modern scientific theory, extending from evolution to relativity, Dr. Faustus strives to boldly go to the depths of the ocean where creatures produce their own chemical means of illumination, and the deep extremities of outer space. At a relatively early point in Leverkorn's musical career, he becomes obsessed with a prostitute having almond-shaped eyes, whose name he encodes within his music, and then, after being warned by her, purposely allows her to infect him with syphilis in the hope that the disease might inspire genius for him as he believed it had done with Friedrich Nietzsche. The music Leverkorn composes becomes increasingly abstract, progressing from an adaptation of William Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, the play in which Sister Carla Mann had been preparing to appear at the time of her cyanide-enabled suicide under circumstances fully described within the novel, to an oratorio depicting the apocalypse and a planned opus to be called The Lamentation of Dr. Faustus. The character Adrian Leverkorn was additionally shown to have written an extensive document describing what seems, to me at any rate, to have been an imagined encounter with a shape-shifting devil, during which the composer, at the age of 21, sold his soul in order to obtain 24 years of professional success, while also sacrificing his ability to love as part of the deal. Writing this biography at the end of the Second World War, at one point in chapter 25, narrator Zeitblum describes being acutely aware of 3 periods of time: that of the events he is addressing, of the time in which he is writing, and of the future time when a curious reader might encounter the resulting work. Zeitblum relates the attempted assassination of Hitler by his own generals, and how the population of Weimar was forced to pass the horror of the crematories in a neighboring concentration camp, asserting all that is German now stands forth as an abomination and a warning. Within the novel, before his mental collapse in 1930, prior to Hitler having come to power, Adrian Leverkorn had unsuccessfully attempted to marry and then taken an amazingly charming nephew, his sister's son, under his care, and in his mind, causing the boy to die by coming to love him in direct violation of his contract with the devil, before then lapsing into the brain disease under the care of his mother that would finally take his life a decade later. The epilogue of this fictional life story concludes, God, be merciful to thy poor soul, my friend, my fatherland. What each of the Mann writers chiefly chronicled, sometimes from sharply contrasting points of view, was a profoundly nuanced depiction of the first 4 decades of the 20th century. Today, it's easily possible to see mistakes resulting from the myopic, isolationist, authoritarian nationalism of the times they addressed. However, in the spirit of history repeats itself and whatever goes around comes around, I suppose in that future time Dr. Faustus was envisioned to be read, what might aptly be observed regarding the far right-leaning Make America Great Again anti-democratic authoritarian Christian nationalism within Thomas Mann's adopted country of the United States can be derived from the biblical New Testament Romans 2:1, where it is written, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on another. For on whatever grounds you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." Or maybe even Luke 6:41. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but fail to notice the beam in your own eye? I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.
Very good.
Couple things pushed through. Didn't want you to have to redo anything.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, this is good.